was a resurrection. What's a datum is that we've got a small number of texts that report that there was a resurrection, and then we see which view has the better explanation of why those texts report what they do. So that was kind of the way that I want to deal with the problem that you're raising. Now, it could happen that you come up against, you've got your theory and you meet someone and there's just hardly any, in principle, you could imagine this happening. There's hardly anything that you agree about. So then you just don't have any data. Then I suspect there's going to be kind of no interesting meeting of the mind and no way that you can kind of put together mutually satisfying discussion. But that doesn't seem all that surprising as an outcome. But also, in practice, that doesn't happen. In practice, we're all we can, like, even if we can't agree that there was a resurrection, we can certainly agree that there's a bunch of texts that say that there were, and we can just treat that as the data.
I see. Okay, so do you think that there's any kind of principal criteria that we could use to say what is data, but that isn't going to be really theory laden, or you think it's just something we'll just agree? We just have vastly more agreement than disagreement about what counts, and we just focus on what we agree on. Something like that.
So yeah, that's what I think we do. So if there's a disagreement between us, if we're going to try to make any progress on resolving our disagreement, we better first of all identify a whole range of stuff that we agree on. Otherwise, there's just no prospect of going forwards. So yeah, I think that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Timber, so much. Professor Oppy, there is a couple of questions about what you believe the best response is to traditional arguments for God. So what would be your, let's say, the traditional objection to the cosmological argument and the teleological argument? And we will save the ontological for later, but for now, the top two ones that have been used, well, actually three, but we're going to concentrate on two, which are cosmological and teleological, since the times of Aristotle. How can you, of course, a couple of minutes won't do it justice, but basically, what would be the summary of where you think these arguments fail and what they fail to accomplish? Thank you.
Okay, so maybe I can start off by saying something really general. So when you've got an argument with the conclusion that God exists, if you're a non-believer, odds are that, assuming that the argument is a valid argument, so the conclusion's really supported by the premises, that you're just going to reject one or more of the premises. And what would be required for the argument to be any sort of challenge to you at all is that you accepted all of the premises and didn't accept the conclusion. And I've never come across an argument, cosmological, teleological, ontological, whatever, that has those properties. So that will be the kind of the short answer. The kind of interesting question is, okay, pick a particular argument, pick a particular cosmological argument or a particular teleological argument or a particular argument from morality or whatever, and say, okay, so here's the bunch of premises in this argument. What do you say about these premises? And then you pick out the one or the ones that you don't accept. So that's a kind of general answer. Let's go back to, because you asked me in particular about cosmological arguments.
Yeah, and teleological.
Yeah, okay. But cosmological arguments are easier given what I've already said, because for some of the cosmological arguments, I might actually accept all of their premises and accept their conclusion. If the conclusion is that there's a kind of necessary origin, well, I don't dispute that. I just think that that's the beginning of the universe, or the beginning of natural reality. So there are some cosmological arguments, it depends how they're set up and what their conclusions are, or I'm just going to say, yep, that's a sound argument, but it doesn't establish a conclusion that is any threat to naturalism. Other cosmological arguments have the conclusion that God exists. So it depends how you formulate the argument. And in those cases, there'll be some premise that I'll point to and say, I just don't accept that one. And that's how it always turns out. And that's not to say that it's impossible. Like, in the future, I could be wrong about everything and someone could give me an argument with all true premises and the conclusion that God exists. That's clearly a theoretical possibility, but I don't think that that's in the card.
I see. Yeah, and Dr. Oppy, there is, I hope Jack is back. We have, Josh, DM me your question because I missed it. I'm sorry. Can you DM me your question? Anyways, before we move on, there's actually, someone wrote a rather faltering description of you. I'm just going to read it out. I hope you don't find it offensive or anything. So someone wants to say, Dr. Oppy, it's so amazing to have you. I don't want anyone to know this, but I find you a very attractive person. Your jawline is very sharp for an Australian, and I think, in general, you're very informed. Dog, Mutual Maker, you're very informed. I am just very thrilled to see you here. So I hope that wasn't too personal. The person asked me to read this out to you.
Thank you.
Yes, okay, Professor Oppy, so you're not offended. Okay, so Josh wants to ask you a question to you. What do you mean by brute necessity? How is it different than brute contingency? And in what modality is it necessary?
All right, so it's probably, my view is that calling something a brute necessity is kind of redundant. What's necessary is what's true no matter what. But if it's true no matter what, then there's just no explanation for it, because that would be postulating a what. So what I mean then really is that where you put necessities into your theory, those are just theoretical costs. Every time you put a necessity in there, it's a theoretical cost, because it's something that there's not some further thing that you can appeal to explain it. Now, you might, instead of postulating necessities, you might replace them with brute contingencies. You might say, look, it could have been otherwise, but there's no explanation for why it's the way it is, rather than some other way that it might have been. Right, so that would be a brute contingency. That seems to me less, in general, less satisfactory than going for a necessity. But it's, I think, quite a difficult philosophical question to say exactly why. Right, where you've got a brute contingency, there are other possibilities, and there's nothing that explains why it's the way it is rather than other ways it could have been. If you say it's necessary, then you've ruled out there being other possibilities. Maybe that feels better to me, but the kind of downside has to do, at least what part of the downside has to do with the way that lots of my colleagues, philosophical colleagues, think about possibility, that we should suppose that the more possibilities, the better, right? Because pretty much, if you can imagine something, that's a sort of reason for thinking that it's possible. I kind of like the idea of minimizing the possibilities instead, and saying, in order to think that something's possible, you've got to have a reason for thinking that it's possible. That's not it's by no means a universal view in philosophy. In fact, it's probably a kind of minority view, but that's a view.
Can I follow up on some of the things you just said?
Yeah.
So one thing that confuses me about what you're saying is, well, first of all, I don't think you answered the question about modality. Is it just, I mean, there's a phrase out there, but maybe you know what I'm talking about. Is it just metaphysical? Because, like, certainly you wouldn't say, like, it's some sort of logical necessity. So the brute necessity there is some sort of metaphysical necessity, or would you go as strong as saying that your naturalistic view is logically necessary?
So it's not a narrow logical necessity. It's not a theorem of logic. I know it's something that we talked about a little bit earlier on. So I am thinking about it as metaphysical, right? So the idea was it's theoretical postulation, and it's certainly not a priori or analytic or a matter of logic. I'm not thinking about the necessities that way.
Okay. I think I could follow up about the broad and narrow scope there, because I think I understand this differently than a lot of people might, but I won't get bogged down in that issue. One thing I wanted to ask is about the reasons for thinking that something is possible. It sounds to me like you're conflating epistemic possibility with metaphysical possibility, because I think on your view, if you think that anything is necessary, I mean, I don't understand how, it's not the case that just modal collapse follows from that, right? Unless there are some necessary facts and then some also brute contingent facts, right? But then when you suggest that something is possible, is the idea there, like, if you take, let's take quantum mechanics as a a paradigmatic example of something like this, right? So the idea that maybe the naturalistic state of affairs is necessary, but that any decay of like an alpha particle or whatever, that's going to be some sort of brute contingency. But we know about the space of, like, then maybe there's some sort of inductive inference about the space of, like, whether or not some particle will decay, the probability space. So is that the kind of idea that you're thinking about? Well, we know it's possible that this particle decays, or it's possible that it doesn't decay, and that's just some sort of inductive inference from past particles or something like that. So that's the reason that we have to think that those are the two possibilities?
So I'm thinking something very much along the lines that you just outlined. So every possible world starts from the same initial state. The possible worlds diverge only because chances play out differently. So you've got a chancy evolution of state of the universe. The reason for thinking that is because, at least on some interpretations of quantum mechanics, it looks like the evolution of state is chancy. But you can't have chances unless you've got possibilities. And so this is what I meant about you've got to have a reason for possibilities. The only reason that you've got for supposing that there are possibilities, according to me, is because you think there are chances. So you think that there's indeterministic causation. And so that fills out, if you're thinking for a kind of model about what model space looks like, it's the kind of branching tree that people like Storrs McCall postulated. Yeah?
Josh, is that all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's enough to answer the question. There's no conflation between. I deny that there's a conflation between epistemic and ontological considerations here. It's very clear. I'm talking about metaphysical possibilities. I don't really like talking about epistemic possibilities. I don't think that that's really a kind of modality. That's something else that I would like to handle in a different way.
Dr. Oppy, a little bit of a lighthearted question, I guess, but has kind of implications, I guess. Who do you consider the most formidable theist philosopher today?
I don't know. Formidable's kind of a hard word. There are lots of theist philosophers that I like. There are some that I get on with really well. There are lots of them who are really good. So let me mention two. So I really like Josh Rasmussen. I've had a bunch of good conversations with him. I've recently written a book. It'll be out in a few months. So kind of debate about the existence of God book with Kenny Pierce. He's another Christian philosopher that I really like, and I think is really terrific. But there are lots. I have lots of friends in philosophy.
No, I see. Dr. Oppy, another question that came in. Do you grant that theists are rational as far as their philosophy is concerned? Do you believe theism is do you believe theism is rational? And the second question is, which I just tied together, do you grant that theists are rational?
So, I mean, I think I'll answer that question this way. Pick any kind of worldview and think about the way that rationality is distributed over the proponents of the worldview. Some of them will be totally irrational, and they'll be irrational in holding the worldview. Some of them will be rational, and they'll be rational in holding the worldview. I mean, for any kind of established worldview, there's going to be some distribution like that. I don't think that there's any reason to think that in general theists have got to be kind of more irrational than non-theists.
I see.
Yeah.
That's a very comprehensive answer. That's a very interesting answer, I suppose. Okay, another question that we wanted to ask you, Dr. Oppy, and I hope Jack is here because I want him to hear this. Basically, in philosophy of language, what's your thoughts on direct reference theory? Do you accept the causal reference theory, sometimes known as the direct reference theory? Why or why not? Please.
Okay, so this is going way back. So I wrote my dissertation about this topic. I'm not sure how much I need to explain the background to it to make it accessible to people who are listening. The answer is sort of yes and no, because in the debate between Fregeans and Russellians, roughly speaking, the people who believed in modes of presentation being part of semantics, and the people like Salmon and Soames who think that modes of presentation have got nothing to do with semantics, but they only come up in pragmatics. I fell on the Fregean side, not because I rejected direct reference, but because I rejected a principle called semantic innocence. And I mean, I don't know whether you really want me to try and explain this or not. It's something I haven't thought about since about 1994.
I was thinking.
Just a minute before we get to a new question. I just want to ask on this one. Yes. We'll get to you. Just a minute though. Yes. Dr. Oppy. That was a comprehensive answer, but here's a question I want. Do you believe that the view that Putnam and Kripke espoused, the sort of robust externalism, do you think you disagree with that view? Do you have your objections to that view?
So I don't think that I object to the kind of externalism about content. I don't think that I object to that.
Okay, I see. I understand. So Josh, okay, as long as it's not a really long question, go ahead.
No, I was thinking while I was muted about what you had said, and it seems to me that on your view on naturalism, things that have to be necessary are probably like the physical laws, or what has to be necessary. So whatever is hypothetically consistent with our physical laws would be something that would be a reason for us to think is possible. Is that sort of like your view? Because I can't see how the physical laws not being necessary on a view like the view that you have would make any sense.
Yeah. So I certainly think that, I mean, if we're going to go along with laws as part of our ontology, then I think the laws are necessary. But it's not just consistency with the laws, because I think the initial conditions are necessary too. Right? The only way that contingency comes in is because the evolution of state is chancy, on my preferred view. And of course, it might turn out that there are reasons why this won't fly. Like, I mean, it might turn out eventually to be inconsistent with best physical theory, to suppose that that's how it is, in which case, who knows, maybe infinite regress, or, or just contingent origin or whatever. it's important to the view that the evolution of state is chancy, because otherwise, as I think you said before, you will just get modal collapse, especially given that I want sort of boundary conditions and laws both to be necessary.
I wasn't presupposing ontology with my question about laws. I was just saying that insofar as there is, I mean, it depends on what you think of, like, ontology. I was just thinking, like, even if you had a Humean view, like a view of constant conjunction, it's just insofar as things are deterministic, or like 100% deterministic in this universe, they're going to be 100% deterministic in all universes, right? That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. But if you've got necessity of the laws and the initial conditions, so we're thinking determinism plus fixed starting point, only one starting point, you'll end up with modal collapse from that.
Yes, Dr.AVi, that's a wonderful question, a wonderful, comprehensive answer as you've been. I mean, I had no doubt, but just hearing you answer these questions so comprehensively, as a philosophy enthusiast myself, who read philosophy every day, it's just really amazing to see how well you handle questions like this. So, we have another one. We have another question, and this is about specifically the ontological argument, modal ontological argument especially. And the question is, can you briefly summarize what was the problems you found with the modal reformulation of this very storied and long argument? And do you believe it's time to completely give up, for theists to completely give up trying to reformulate it, or do you believe it could potentially be saved?
Okay, so the kind of core to the modal ontological argument is the idea that kind of necessarily, if God exists of necessity. So there are two possibilities, either two possibilities in the following sense. There's two different models that we can make. Either it's the case that God exists in all possible worlds, or it's the case that God exists in no possible world. Right? They're the two models. I mean, it's not really right to say they're both possibilities, right? So I'll avoid saying it like that. So either God exists in all possible worlds, or God exists in no possible worlds. And which model is correct is sort of up for grabs. Now, the proponent of the modal ontological argument wants to argue as follows: God exists in at least one possible world. It's possible that God exists. So God exists in all worlds, hence in particular God exists. Right. And you might think, well, maybe that looks like a good argument, but remember that the alternative that was on the table was God exists in no worlds. God doesn't exist in at least one world, therefore God exists in no worlds. There's another argument that leads you to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. It just starts from the claim that it's possible that God doesn't exist. So if we consider the key premises here, on the one hand, it's possible that God exists, on the other hand, it's possible that God doesn't exist. It's not clear why anybody who thought that God exists would be tempted by the premise that it's possible that God doesn't exist, and anyone who thought that God doesn't exist would be tempted by the premise that it's possible that God does exist. It looks as though the two arguments are kind of on a par, which is just to say they're both equally ineffective. That's the kind of, I think, the standard reply to a modal ontological argument.
I see. That is great. So, Isaac, please take it away. Please.
Sure. Hi, Graham. Nice to meet you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, sure. Hi.
Hi. So, I actually was curious. I guess CC has sort of tried to spark a bit of conversation between you and Jack. I'm curious if Jack delivers his sort of take on metaphysical possibility, what you make of it.
Can you ask the question again? Sorry.
Yeah, well, Jack's presumably there right now. Right?
Yeah, Jack is slightly away for a little bit. I guess we'll have to wait till he comes back.
Yeah, because what I'd be interested in is I think that you guys have disagreements around metaphysical possibility. I wouldn't be able to describe his view properly, but I'd be very curious to see what yeah.
I don't really I mean, Dr.AVi wants to say that, I take it you think that there's some notion of necessity and possibility, which is kind of like a pre-theoretical, and that you're just saying that this notion of metaphysical possibility that you have, which is that everything that shares a common causal origin, that initial origin point, if it's necessary, counts as what you mean by metaphysical necessity, as opposed to logical or conceptual necessity.
So I'm not sure that it's pre-theoretical. So, and one of the things that philosophers disagree about is what's the right account of necessity, or what's the right way of explaining the kind of acceptable ways that we talk about what's necessary and what's possible. And one of the kind of important things when we're thinking about the way we talk is to kind of separate out where what we're talking about is doxastic or epistemic from where it's metaphysical. And I think that a kind of neat way to divide this stuff up is the way that I go. So where I make the space of metaphysical possibility fairly small. And if you want to talk that way, the space of epistemic possibility may be quite large, but that's a different question. So I'm not sure that it's pre-theoretical, but it's important. Part of what I like to do is to have some way of accommodating all the disagreements that people make, to kind of make sense of the disagreements. And unfortunately, pretty much everything in philosophy is controversial, in particular how to explain the ways that we talk about necessity and possibility is controversial.
I guess the part that seems sort of odd to me is that it sounds like what you're saying is your preferred view is that the starting point for natural reality, the initial conditions and so on, is metaphysically necessary, but logically contingent. Is that right?
I'm saying, would I say that it's logically contingent? I don't know that I want to talk that way. What I want to say is, it's certainly not a theorem of logic or something that you can figure out entirely a priori on the basis of no data whatsoever, or something that's just so because of the meanings that we give to the words that there's a necessary origin. Right? So what I want to say is that it's metaphysically necessary that there's such an origin, well, given subject to the qualifications I gave earlier, right? I mean, it's my preferred view, but I'm not going to die in a ditch for it. It's definitely a controversial view, and lots of people are going to disagree about it. And I certainly don't want to say that their views are ruled out a priori or by logic or by the meanings of our words or whatever. If we're going to compare the views and try to arrive at an assessment of which one's better, it's going to be using the same methodology that I want to use everywhere. So we just elaborate the theories and then we try to compute the theoretical virtue of the competing views.
Well, maybe just one other question in this context to help clarify. So you said that you take the idea that the starting point for natural reality as being metaphysically necessary is sort of like what you would say at the point of a gun, and you're open to the possibility that it's actually contingent. I presume by contingent there you mean brutally contingent if there's no sort of infinite chain of causal explanations. There'd be no initial point, I guess, if that were the case. So if there is an initial point, you're open to it being brutally contingent. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is what it really means to say that it's like whether there's something informative that can be said to distinguish the two options, the one in which it's brutally contingent and the one in which it's metaphysically necessary, because it seems like the only way to do that, that's obvious to me, is to think about that in terms of conceptual necessities. But it seems like you were resistant to that characterization. So I'm just wondering if there's something informative you could say about, I mean, are you just saying that there's nothing more to say other than one is metaphysical, other than that on one view, the starting point for natural reality is metaphysically necessary, and on the other view, it's brutally contingent? Or can you actually characterize what that actually means in through some further elaboration?
I don't know whether this will help or not. So let's suppose that our modal logic is S5. You can make a kind of S5 model in which it's clear that every world shares the same origin. You can make an S5 model in which it's clear that different worlds have, the origins of different worlds have different properties, so that the origin's not necessary. That's a way of kind of spelling. Maybe you think, though, that that's just a way of spelling out what it means to say, on the one hand, that it's necessary, on the other hand, that it's contingent, but doesn't do it in a way that you would count as informative. One thing I don't want to do is say that these are both possibilities, because I don't think that makes sense. But what is true is that there are plenty of people who have held the view that there's a brutally contingent origin, right? And I mean, it's a very common view amongst atheists right up to the present. And so you want to be able to talk about the views. So if there was a modality here, it's something like, it's possible for philosophers reasonably to maintain that, or something like that would be the kind of overarching modality. So it's not quite epistemic. Maybe it's kind of a special kind of doxastic thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That was the discussion I was sort of hoping to see. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oppy, for that wonderful explanation. I have a question. What are your thoughts, briefly, on Dr. William Lane Craig and his work?
Where to start? So he's very. I think he's a good philosopher. I know Bill reasonably well. I've known him for quite a long time. I've had lunch with him a couple of times and had conversations with him about various kinds of things. He's incredibly productive, so he's got a vast output. anybody, and so this applies to me as much as it does to him, anybody who writes that much stuff, it's of slightly variable quality, so some of it's better than others. He's written some really good stuff that's been published in great journals. There's stuff that we agree about. So if you've seen, there was a book that we both contributed to on God and abstract objects. And it turns out that we're both kinds of fans of Steve Yablow's version of nominalism, and there's quite a lot of common ground there. There's a bunch of other areas where we've got common ground. In some ways, we've actually, I think, had influence on each other, which has led to some convergence of our views as well. Of course, there's lots of things that I disagree with him about quite strongly, perhaps more in kind of political areas than in kind of metaphysical areas.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Oppy, for that response. So, without further ado, Youth Resist. You're up. Oh, Youth Resist isn't here. I better ping him. Okay, in the meantime, there's another question. Dog, just a second. Dog, mute your microphone. Okay. One question, Dr. Oppy, for you. Do you believe idealism can be rescued, or is it a done deal?
So I've written a paper against idealism in which I argue that a kind of naturalistic realism is just a better view than idealism. I think of idealism as a kind of skepticism. I think of it as a kind of way of denying that there's an external that there's an external world. On the way that I think about idealism, say theistic idealism, what there is just minds, with God being the kind of big super mind that feeds experiences to the other minds. And that's what reality is. So on that view, it seems to me there aren't all of the things that we think of as being part of the external world. There aren't trees, right? There's just kind of tree representations in the minds. That seems to me to be a kind of skepticism, which I don't like.
Yes, that's wonderful, Dr. Oppy. Actually, I had a little bit of a personal stake in this because I consider myself an idealist. So, I guess that's the answer I have to live with. Okay, Youth Resist, you're up. Please go ahead. Dr. Oppy, this is a 15-year-old Christian person who is a big fan of your work. He admires your intelligence and your work, and he would like to ask you your questions directly on voice. Go ahead, Youth.
Hello, Dr. Oppy. Thank you for your time, and I would like to ask you a question on theoretical virtues, since in your case for naturalism specifically, using theoretical virtues to compare different metaphysical theories is really essential to your case. So what I wanted to know, at least from your point of view, is what would be the criterion by which we would evaluate a theoretical virtue or a possible theoretical virtue and say that it is a valid way of evaluating different metaphysical theories.
Right. So that's a really good question. And I'm not sure that I'm going to have a satisfactory answer to that question. What I think is that it's kind of obvious that when we're comparing theories, that on the one hand, it's a good thing to try to minimize your commitments, and on the other hand, it's a good thing to try to explain as much as you can. And that when we're comparing theories, we see which one we should prefer, the one that does best at the trade-off between those two tasks, right? You can imagine a theory that takes every bit of data as just a primitive, right? And then it explains everything, but at maximal cost. So that would be a kind of bad theory. Right, sorry. Let me start again. You can imagine a theory that postulates nothing, so it can't explain anything, right? Because it's got no explanatory resources. So a kind of nihilism, there isn't anything, is going to be a kind of as bad as a theory can get. On the other hand, you can imagine a theory that for each bit of data postulates something new to explain that bit of data. And that theory will be kind of as expensive as it's possible for a theory to be, right? Because it posits new stuff for each bit of data. It seems to me sort of obvious that the best theories are going to be somewhere in the middle. They're going to make some kind of decent trade-off between minimizing the number of posits that you make and maximizing how much you explain. It might be that the best theory you can come up with is going to leave a few things unexplained. It might be that the best theory that you come up with is fairly complicated. It postulates quite a lot of things. Okay, so I think those two things and that way of thinking about how you balance them is kind of straightforward. And it's a methodology that you see getting used all over the place. What's more interesting is whether there are other theoretical virtues that don't reduce to one or the other of those two. I'm inclined to think not. So I'm inclined to think that they're the only two, so that you can describe the methodology as one in which you just think about how you trade off simplicity against breadth and depth of explanation. But if, for example, so some people think, for example, that fit with established science is a theoretical virtue that doesn't reduce to those two, whereas I'm inclined to think that it just gets subsumed under, fit with the data, that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that was a very, I think, comprehensive answer to my question. And I definitely concur with you that simplicity, explanatory power, and scope are probably the only reliable virtues that we can use in evaluating different theories. Because when it comes down to it, those are really the only virtues that we can objectively verify or say lend actual probability to a specific hypothesis over another. Whereas if we accept other theoretical virtues, we're eventually left with a bunch of odious criterions and ways of evaluating theories that don't really get us anywhere. So, yeah, I think that was a very comprehensive answer, and I think it's one that I agree with. So, thank you.
Okay, so I will say one thing, that it's not entirely straightforward to do this weighing of simplicity against explanatory breadth and depth. It would be nice if it was easy, but it isn't.
Dr. Oppy, we have Jonathan in line, who's been waiting to ask you your question. Jonathan, take it away.
Yeah,